Hello, you're watching Global Insight with me, Young. From Arirang News Centre in Seoul, we speak to experts from around the world to hear their views on issues making headlines. Intelligence chiefs from South Korea, the United States and Japan are likely to meet this week in Tokyo, according to Japanese media. This comes after the three countries' top diplomats held their first trilateral talks in over a year, as well as a three-way meeting of military chiefs in Hawaii the week before. Since the Biden administration took office, the US has been pushing for stronger trilateral cooperation amid major regional security challenges, primarily the nuclear threat from North Korea and the intense rivalry between Washington and Beijing. But to make the three-way relationship work, Seoul and Tokyo will have to overcome their dispute over contentious historical issues. Today, we discuss the way forward for South Korea and Japan and their cooperation with the United States. And for this, we have Kim Byung-ju, professor at the Konkuk University of Foreign Studies here in Seoul. And we also connect with Jonathan Berkshire-Miller, senior fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs. A warm welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us. And, well, let's start with you, Professor Kim. Now, South Korea and Japan's foreign minister, they held a separate meeting after their trilateral talks with Antony Blinken last week. But it was reportedly a very awkward affair, and perhaps understandably so, because Tokyo had published its diplomatic blue book just days before and took its usual hardline stance against Seoul on very contentious areas of conflict. What did you make of this meeting, and do you think Seoul and Tokyo right now have enough political will to actually actively mend their ties at this point?
Right. Having enough political will or not is a big question that a lot of people, a lot of experts are thinking about at this point, keeping in mind, in fact, with the critical timing approaching with the G7 meeting and others are coming up. And President Moon Jae-in of Korea is meeting with President Biden very soon in May as well. So we are hoping for steps towards kind of improving the ties between Seoul and Tokyo. But this particular meeting between the foreign ministers, as you pointed out, was quite disappointing to the observers who have been hoping for some kind of opportunity to seek some kind of turnaround for the better. The thing is, you mentioned the Japanese Blue Book, but also inside Korea, the timing of it, Japan's release of their position, their statement, what they'll have to do with the processed waste nuclear wastewater in Fukushima, that caused a lot of concern in the minds of Korean people. And Foreign Minister Chung had to kind of bring up that issue, which, of course, from Japanese perspective, was not a very welcome gesture at all at this meeting that has been materialized after such a long time of freeze. So it was a very, very difficult time. Minister Chung, I know he has expressed different opinion inside Korea at National Assembly, saying that what Japan is doing would be okay as long as they go along with the IAEA guidelines. So he was a diplomat playing this double game, very difficult double game, trying to serve Korea's national interest. At home, trying to persuade Korean public in a way to find a middle ground, but overseas he had to be loyal to the sentiment of Korean people, and he had to bring this up. And so overall, the meeting had to go that way, and it was very unfortunate.
Well, I suppose it is meaningful that it did happen after all this time and after months of not speaking between the two foreign ministers. And well, Mr. Berkshire-Miller, now we've seen this flurry of security-related meetings that have taken place and are set to take place between the three countries. But do you also think there's enough? Do you think there's enough political will right now between Seoul and Tokyo to patch things up diplomatically? I mean, do you think it's even possible for the two neighbours to narrow their differences at this point, or do you think this sort of forced civility between them is the best they can do?
Well, thanks for the great question. And I would agree with a lot of the points that Professor Kim made. I think one of the things to contextualize from Japan's perspective is the timing. So obviously, Prime Minister Suga is in his first year. He's, the former chief of staff of Prime Minister Abe. who is the longest-serving Japanese modern-day prime minister. But not only does Prime Minister Suga have to deal with the COVID-19 situation, which continues to escalate in Japan, they have the Summer Olympics coming up this summer. And in addition, there's going to be very likely a general election this fall. So there's a lot of challenges from the Japanese side, a lot of headwinds for the ability to take risks. That being said, I think it has been seen as a positive development to have the trilateral talks alongside the United States. And I think the Japanese will continue to think in a two-track scenario. On one track, they will look at the bilateral issues, which are very thorny and seemingly intractable. And on the second side, I think they'll look at what is essential to work with vis-a-vis South Korea. And I think a lot of that is trilateral security cooperation on the Korean Peninsula.
Well, and it has been very difficult to bring the two together in terms of these historical issues. And Professor Kim, until now, the United States has avoided getting too involved in the rift between the two neighbours. But if it wants to see them genuinely strengthen ties and really boost this Indo-Pacific alliance that the US keeps emphasising, do you think Washington is going to have to play a greater role?
I think Washington knows that it will have to play a greater role, and it faces great need for it. The timing itself is a little bit tricky, as you and Professor Miller has allured. The timing of it, Japan having general election probably in the fall, and Korea having presidential election next March. So Washington faces uncertainty in terms of who will be actually running the foreign policy going forward from here, and whether these people who are keeping, staying in their offices right at this point will be the ones that they will have to deal with. Do they have incentive to go along with what Washington is going to urge? So it's a big challenge. In terms of Washington's past memory and experience, Washington shares equally or maybe greater sum of disappointment, because it was Obama who pushed very hard for some kind of agreement between Seoul and Tokyo back in 2015, and the way the 2015 agreement between Tokyo and Seoul, the way it came about, a big part of it was the United States playing this very important role behind the scenes. But it was shut down by President Moon Jae-in as soon as he came into office. And so when Washington saw that, and as Washington now recalls that process, it's a very, very difficult memory to call back. And so it's a very steep climb they have to climb back on. But I know there is a strong need for it, and Washington will do what it can, indeed, to improve the relationship between the two. Just timing itself right now is very challenging and tough.
Right, so a lot of uncertainty for Washington there. And Mr. Bircham-Miller, same question to you. Do you think that US officials, they're going to have to get their hands deep in if they really want to strengthen alliances in the Asia-Pacific?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of yes and no. I think, the timing is key, as Professor Kim mentioned, but the context is really key. And I think, Professor Kim mentioned a bit about the Obama administration and its approach, but also several of the current individuals, the main principles that are guiding this relationship are holdovers from the Obama administration. Secretary Blinken, National Security Advisor Sullivan, many of these individuals have an experience directly on this issue, so have learned from some of those experiences that didn't work under the Obama years. So my sense is that rather than looking at this in a grand bargain approach and trying to solve all the challenges in the Japan-Korea relationship and taking a sort of middle position in that, I think you'll see the U.S. be much more pragmatic in focusing on some of the things that really are essential to U.S. interests, whether that be working together on North Korea, but increasingly looking at China and where the three can converge on policy regarding China.
And China definitely seems to have been the greatest issue, and while Japan's taken a very strong stance against China compared to the past, and while Professor Kim, both countries, South Korea and Japan, they are set to suffer substantive economic losses if they keep their distance from China due to their trade relations. What are some areas then do you think that South Korea and Japan can really start cooperating on as they attempt to mend their ties and strengthen their alliance?
In considering the reply to that question, I think we have to differentiate between the two different issue areas. Number one is industrial side, and then second one would be consumer side. Industrial side, since 2019, when Japan announced their kind of trade actions against Korean. They didn't say it was against that, but everyone knew that it was against Korean court's ruling that has allowed repatriation from Japanese corporations for their slave labor during the colonial time. And Japan took all these actions in terms of like export control and all that. And then as a result of it, the division of labor or supply chain between Japan and Korea of some of the key cutting edge IT materials have been dismantled. And Korean government now claims that it achieved a victory by achieving autonomy from or independence from the reliance upon Japanese supply and all that. So some people may like it, some people may not like it. It's depending on whom you ask. But that industrial side of supply chain mechanism has faced changes as a result of this political turmoil so far. Setting that aside, I think for me, what's really important is the consumer side, or ordinary citizen side. If this kind of condition of relationship continues, it hurts ordinary citizens. Japanese, I know a lot of Japanese really like Korea, Korean culture, Korean food. They want to come to Korea, but they are very hesitant, thinking that the country does not welcome them. Same thing. Many young Koreans, especially, they do like Japan. They do like to visit Japan. These are all opportunities for tourism, consumption, and all that kind of stuff. But they're being discouraged by this nationalistic feeling that we face in this country. So that's all the more unfortunate. And we have to keep in mind, one of the key factors that could help improve the bilateral tie is the citizens exchange, people going back and forth between the countries. Of course, we have COVID-19, another factor added here, but consuming their food, consuming their culture and stuff. And this is kind of like a limiting the freedom of private individual choices. And I see a lot more of unfortunate aspect as a result of this freeze in the relationship. And that's what we are losing big time, in my own view.
Right, so moving away from this rather political bias that we've seen over a good number of years. And, well, Mr. Vircher-Miller, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this too. What do you think are some areas of common ground between the two countries? And what do you think would be the first step to building this future-oriented relationship that they keep talking about?
Well, I think one of the challenges currently is, and I think has been, especially in the past few years, I think we're seeing a little bit of a quiet to this, which I'm happy about, is that the tensions in that relationship are there bilaterally, but we hope that they're not there in a multilateral sense. And I think this, in the multilateral fora, this suggests an opportunity for Japan and Korea to find ways to cooperate where they're not able to as much on the bilateral because of some of the tensions they have. Now, one example I'll point to you is that Korea and Japan effectively have a mini free trade agreement now through the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the largest trade partnership in the region now, which was signed fairly recently. So while we don't have a Korea-Japan free trade agreement, they're also working in tandem right now, actually, with one vis-a-vis China, trilateral. There are creative ways to sort of improve that economic relationship that are not as high profile as doing something like a bilateral deal. Other areas I think that we can look at too is getting outside of the old comfortable shoe, which is North Korea security cooperation. That seems to be the only thing in recent years that the two sides have really agreed on. And getting away from the uncomfortable shoe, which is historical issues, and looking at some other issues. So one area I think is very fruitful to cooperate on is the Indo-Pacific. I know South Korea is concerned a bit about Japan's positioning of a free and open Indo-Pacific, but the reality is, if you look at South Korea's southern strategy in the ASEAN region, there's many similarities at the way that they look at open, free investment, infrastructure, and frankly, even some of the security concerns that they have in the region. So I think that there's ways, even if it's not deep integration, for them just to note and to reference the utility of each other's strategies in the region.
So really looking for more common areas rather than differences, I suppose. And Professor Kim, what do you think would be the first step towards creating better ties between the two neighbors?
I think the most important factor is for all of us, all Japanese and Koreans, to keep in mind that countries, that the other side of the country is not one and unified. For example, for Koreans, we should keep in mind, in Japan, while we have ultra-rightist, ultra-conservatives who are arguing for all this feeling against Korea in Japan, there are a vast number of Japanese who are potentially would like to have more exchange and enjoy everything about Korea in that country. So those are the people that we have to pay attention to, and we should make sure that we don't turn them into Korea's enemies. Same thing for Japan. They should keep in mind that Korea is not unified behind all these causes against Japan, whether we have a large number of Korean people who like the country, Japan, as it is. So we should encourage these people's feelings to remain the way they are right now, and then keep them as the basis for the future improvement. While some of the politicians, indeed in both sides, abuse and use history as a tool to mobilize their political support, to strengthen their political base, we should actually make sure that this doesn't happen. I know our powers are limited, but still, we have to watch out for political forces in both countries using history as their political mobilization tools. So that's what we have to watch out for. And these are the people are the ones who come back to us again and again with the history. But Japan claiming certain territories are theirs based on things that happened in the past, and Korea raising again all these thorny issues about what happened 70 years ago, it doesn't help in terms of improving the relationship between the two countries. So we just hope to see more of the activities on the side of the people who care about the improving relations between the two getting further encouraged and grow further. That's what I hope to see going forward.
Well, we're out of time today, I'm afraid, so this is where we'll have to end this interview. But that was Kim Byung-ju, Professor at the Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, and Jonathan Berkshire-Miller, Senior Fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me on.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.